Have you ever seen a millionaire's prized racehorse cast aside like an old shoe, only to be rescued by someone with nothing but heart and determination? In this story, you'll witness the thrilling moment a humble ranch girl comes face to face with powerful men who think money rules all. You'll be on the edge of your seat as she refuses to back down, protecting an injured horse that everyone else deemed worthless. Will her courage be enough to stand against wealth and influence? Or will she lose everything for a horse she just couldn't abandon? Stick around to find out how it all ends, and trust me, you won't want to miss a single twist. If stories of compassion, defiance, and second chances ignite your spirit, then make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on more amazing tales just like this one. Eloise Caldwell had known hardship from an early age. She lived on a modest ranch wedged between rolling hills and dense woodlands, with a single dirt road connecting it to the nearest town. Her weather-beaten home, constructed largely of salvaged timber, had once belonged to her grandfather, a man who passed down two essential lessons: never abandon those who depend on you, and always stand up for what's right. At 19, Eloise was the sole caretaker of her land, assisted by a few animals she tended with unwavering commitment. Each sunrise found her outside, a basket slung over her arm, and her beloved donkey Luna trailing behind. Today was no different as she ventured out in the chilly morning air to gather herbs and fill a pail from the bubbling creek that cut through her property. To Eloise, the ranch was more than just a patch of soil. It was a companion in her journey. The towering oaks, their bark gnarled by time, swayed gently in the breeze. A few paces behind her, Luna plodded along, ears twitching to swat away insects. Eloise's dog, Biscuit, a spotted mongrel with boundless energy, darted ahead to sniff at interesting scents in the underbrush. Despite the peaceful scene, she harbored a nagging apprehension in her heart. While gossip rarely interested Eloise, she couldn't ignore the murmurs in town. Rumors about a wealthy landowner whose name inspired both respect and dread. They called him Remington Vance, a man of opulence who stopped at nothing to maintain his status. Yet Eloise had never imagined that her path would cross his in any direct way, or that his actions would echo in her quiet, out-of-the-way life. Remington Vance was everything Eloise was not: rich, powerful, and entirely sure of his place in the world. His estate, located miles from her own humble holdings, was reputed to be a palatial marvel, with marble stables and manicured grounds. People claimed he hosted lavish events, including high-stakes horse races that drew spectators from all over. Remington was known to chase trophies and prestige, investing astronomical sums in purebred horses whose victories only served to multiply his fortune. That morning, as she shuffled toward the creek with her pail rattling faintly and Biscuit scampering ahead, she saw something that made her come to a sudden halt: a dark shape, limping near the water's edge. At first, she thought it might be a deer, but as she drew closer, she realized it was no deer at all. What stood before her, struggling to remain upright, was a magnificent ebony horse. Its glossy black coat, though caked with mud and cuts, still revealed the regal lines of a thoroughbred. Confusion flooded Eloise's mind. A creature like this did not simply appear in these woods, especially not in such dismal condition. Her heart twisted at the sight. The horse's left foreleg was swollen, and every breath caused its flank to shudder. Despite the horse's obvious pain, there was something defiant in its gaze, as though it refused to surrender despite overwhelming odds. Eloise advanced slowly, palms raised in a gesture of peace. "Easy now," she murmured, keeping her voice as gentle as a lullaby. She was no stranger to tending wounded animals. Over the years, she had nursed countless lost or injured creatures back to health. But this one felt different. It carried an aura of importance she couldn't quite explain. "I'm not going to hurt you," Eloise said softly. Biscuit barked at the imposing stranger, unsure whether to treat the horse as friend or foe. Eloise quickly hushed her dog, not wanting to startle the wounded giant. The horse's eyes flicked to Biscuit, but soon returned to Eloise, as if gauging her intentions. Closer now, she could see every detail of its distress: the dried blood on its fetlock, the bulge around the tendon, and the trembling legs that threatened to give way beneath its powerful torso. How could anyone allow this majestic creature to roam injured and alone? Moving with deliberate care, Eloise approached until she was within arm's reach. She fished a crust of bread from her pocket, offering it in her outstretched hand. The horse lifted its head, flaring its nostrils. Hunger soon outweighed caution, and it took a tentative step forward, lips grazing the bread before snapping it up. Eloise exhaled in relief, her eyes stinging with emotion. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" she said, letting her other hand stroke the horse's neck. Beneath the coarse tangles, she felt sinewy muscles coiled from years of disciplined training. That, along with the brand near its shoulder, a stylized R, told Eloise that this was no ordinary stray. Her mind raced. Could this be one of Remington Vance's prized racehorses? She'd heard rumor after rumor about his stable of champions. It seemed he was especially fond of one black stallion that won nearly every competition it entered. Had the horse been injured during a race and cast aside like a broken piece of equipment? A pang of anger flared in Eloise's chest. If that were true, it illustrated the cruelty of a man who valued money over life. But she had no time to dwell on speculation. Right now, the horse needed help, and ignoring that would betray everything she believed in. She fashioned a makeshift halter from spare rope in her basket and fastened it gently around the stallion's head, speaking in quiet, reassuring tones. With Luna ambling ahead, Eloise coaxed the wounded horse to move. Every shuffle sent a jolt of pain through its body. It occasionally stumbled, but persisted. Each step was a small miracle, guided by Eloise's patience and soft-spoken encouragement. "Come on now," she whispered. "I'll take care of you." The trek back to her ranch was slow and arduous. Every so often, the horse would falter, and Eloise would pause to let it rest. She couldn't imagine how long it had roamed the forest, cut off from adequate food and water, but she suspected it hadn't been more than a day or two. It likely wouldn't have survived much longer. Meanwhile, Biscuit continued to hover, tail wagging gently as if sensing this new arrival wasn't a threat. By the time they reached her small stable, a crude wooden structure with a hay-filled corner, Eloise felt both exhausted and oddly exhilarated. She guided the stallion inside, settling it on fresh straw. Then she set to work gathering the herbal salve she typically reserved for injured farm animals. As she dabbed the salve on the horse's leg, her mind drifted to names. She decided on Meteor, a nod to the stallion's striking coat and the star-like brilliance of his presence. "What do you think?" she asked quietly, meeting the horse's dark eyes. "Meteor, you were probably fast as a shooting star before all this." The horse responded with a low nicker, lowering its head, as if offering a silent acceptance. Eloise almost laughed, struck by the connection she felt to him already. It was as though her entire life had prepared her for this very moment, saving a wounded creature that fate had thrust into her path. Far from Eloise's quiet ranch, Remington Vance paced an opulent study in his sprawling estate. Everything in his domain, from the antique furnishings to the lavish paintings lining the walls, exuded wealth. The tall windows overlooked pristine paddocks where his horses were groomed and trained by a team of experts on his payroll. Remington thrived on luxury and craved public adulation. A new race season beckoned, and his ambitions soared, but the abrupt disappearance of his best stallion cast a dark cloud over his plans. That morning he summoned Roland, his right-hand man, to the study. "Tell me again, how do you misplace a multi-million-dollar horse?" Remington demanded, voice tight with frustration. Roland, a broad-shouldered figure perpetually wearing a worn-out cowboy hat, shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, you instructed us to get rid of him the night he got hurt," he said, keeping his voice level but subdued. "Said you didn't want to waste time or resources on a horse that would never race again." Remington clenched his fists at the memory. Yes, he had given that order in a surge of rage and impatience. Meteor, the stallion he'd personally selected from an acclaimed breeder, had failed him by tearing a tendon mid-race. Veterinary advice suggested months of costly rehabilitation, with no guarantee of a full return to racing form. For Remington, that outcome spelled only one thing: no more profits. Instead of settling for an animal that would be a perpetual drain on his finances and image, he'd commanded Roland's men to take the horse far away. Now he regretted the impulsive decision for one key reason. He had never removed the official brand from Meteor's hide. If anyone found out that Remington Vance had disposed of a horse so callously, it could damage his standing in the circles he valued most. "Fine," Remington snapped. "Then we need to find him. If there's a chance that someone stumbled upon Meteor, we cannot let the wrong story spread. Roland frowned. We have men scouring the nearby forest, sir, but there's no sign of him yet. Suppressing a curse, Remington inhaled deeply, formulating a plan. Keep looking. Check towns, markets, any place where a horse might have been taken. Offer a reward for any information. This must be handled discreetly. He glared pointedly at Roland. If you fail me in this, I'll see to it you regret it. Back at her ranch, Eloise was oblivious to the search. Her focus remained locked on Meteor's care. She cleaned his wound daily, applying fresh poultices. Despite minimal means, she poured every ounce of compassion and tenacity into the stallion's recovery. He regained some spark as days turned to weeks. His legs still pained him, but the swelling waned, and he stood more confidently with each sunrise. He developed a habit of poking his head over the stable door, ears flicking at the sound of Eloise's voice. In those quiet dawn hours, Eloise would often share stories about her past or about the father who'd instilled in her the importance of kindness. He used to say, she murmured to Meteor one crisp morning, if you can help, then you must. We don't live on this earth alone. Meteor responded by blowing softly as if in agreement. For Eloise, the horse had become family, a living, breathing symbol of how empathy could triumph over neglect and greed. Elsewhere, Remington's men pressed on with their covert inquiries. They roamed through sleepy villages and dusty trading posts, brandishing a photograph of Meteor. To unsuspecting strangers, they'd present themselves as concerned owners seeking a lost horse, omitting the part about having left him to fend for himself. It didn't take long for them to pick up on rumors of a girl out in the hills who had found a black stallion, nursing him from the brink of collapse. That snippet of chatter led them straight to Eloise Caldwell's property, a hidden gem in the valley. The morning they arrived, Eloise was in the stable, massaging Meteor's leg with a warm cloth. Instantly, Biscuit began barking as the sound of unfamiliar horses reached the ranch. Eloise stepped out, heart pounding at the sight of three men astride muscular mounts. Leading them was a stern-faced man sporting a leather vest and dark boots caked with mud, clearly someone unafraid of hard work and intimidation. He introduced himself curtly. Name's Roland Barnes. We're looking for a thoroughbred that's gone missing. Word around town is that you've come across a horse like that. A knot of apprehension formed in Eloise's gut. Still, she spoke calmly. Yes, I found a black stallion, badly injured. Is he yours? Roland nodded, eyes scanning her small ranch. He belongs to Mr. Remington Vance. That horse is extremely valuable, missing for weeks. We'd like him returned. Eloise's pulse quickened. So the rumors were true. Meteor likely hailed from Remington's stable, a place rumored to measure worth solely in money and trophies. Her voice didn't waver as she said, he was abandoned, left out there to die. I won't let you take him back just to be neglected again. Roland's demeanor hardened. Careful, miss. You don't know what you're saying. Eloise stood her ground. I know exactly what I'm saying. If your boss cared about him, he wouldn't have ended up alone, starving, and hurt in those woods. The men behind Roland shifted, clearly ready for confrontation if needed. Sensing the tension, Meteor appeared at the stable doorway, limping but poised defiantly. The sight astonished Roland's men. They recognized the proud stance of a racehorse, not easily cowed. The brand on Meteor's shoulder was unmistakable, a silent confirmation of ownership. After a tense pause, Roland's lips curled into a mirthless grin. Suit yourself, but this isn't over. That horse belongs to Mr. Vance, whether you like it or not. We'll handle things legally if we must. Don't get in the way, or you'll regret it. With that parting shot, Roland and his men wheeled their horses around and galloped off, dust swirling in their wake. Eloise remained in place, face pale, heart thundering in her chest. The confrontation had ended quickly, but she sensed it was only the prelude to a more intense battle. She turned to Meteor, who nickered softly as she stepped closer, running her fingers through his tangled mane. I won't let them take you, she promised. Even if Remington Vance invoked the law, or worse, resorted to intimidation, she wouldn't budge. Meteor had become an emblem of her deepest convictions. If she betrayed him, she'd be betraying herself. That night, as lantern light danced on the stable walls, Eloise prepared for a storm she felt certain was coming. News of Eloise's defiance reached Remington Vance within hours. He flew into a rage, slamming his palm against the oak desk in his study. The opulent surroundings did nothing to ease the boiling anger inside him. She refuses to return him, he demanded, voice razor sharp. Roland, standing stiffly at attention, nodded. Yes, sir. Claims he's hers now because we abandoned him. Remington's fury twisted his features. I won't let some country girl tarnish my reputation. If anyone discovers the horse was deliberately cast aside, no, that can't happen. He contemplated his next move. Years of ruthless business dealings had taught him there were always two ways to get what he wanted: negotiation or intimidation. Negotiation in this case seemed laughable. What could Eloise possibly want that he'd be willing to give? Money? Land? She struck him as the stubborn type who wouldn't cave to bribery. Fine, then intimidation it would be. I'll speak to her myself, he snarled. Prepare my car. I want to see what sort of person believes they can defy me. Remington arrived at Eloise's ranch by midday, stepping out of a sleek black vehicle that looked absurdly out of place amidst the dusty surroundings. A small entourage of men flanked him. By then, a few of Eloise's neighbors had gathered, having heard of the earlier visit. Though they were uncertain of all the facts, they knew one thing. Eloise was a good soul who cared deeply for her animals. Seeing Remington's imposing figure, they hovered protectively around her, forming an impromptu line of solidarity near the gate. Eloise's pulse raced, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had never seen Remington Vance in person, only heard rumors about his wealth and arrogance. Even so, she recognized him immediately. Tall, sharp-featured, clad in a finely tailored suit that screamed affluence. His eyes locked on Eloise, as though scanning for vulnerabilities. You must be Miss Caldwell, he said icily, stepping forward. I'm here to retrieve what belongs to me. Eloise inhaled, lifting her chin. If you're talking about the injured stallion, he's mine now. I found him nearly dead. No one claimed him for weeks. I won't hand him over to be mistreated again. Remington laughed, a cold, dismissive sound. Mistreated? Do you know how much I spent on that horse? He was my pride and joy, until his injury made him worthless on the track. His voice hardened. That doesn't mean you can steal him. Gasps murmured through the neighbors. Eloise flinched but countered calmly. Stealing implies you still wanted him. You threw him away. With those words, the tension broke like a snapped string. Remington's knuckles went white. You need to be very careful. I can ruin people who cross me. Do you think your little farm can survive once I bring the full force of the law down on you? Fear clenched Eloise's stomach, but an undeniable fire sparked in her eyes. I'm not afraid of you. Meteor deserves better. If you insist on taking him, you'll have to do so by force. Silence stretched as they glared at each other. The neighbors stood closer to Eloise, silently backing her. Remington studied their determined faces. He took a step back, flicking an annoyed glance at Roland, who hovered behind him. Very well, he said at last, voice thick with contempt. You've made your choice. Just remember, defying me has consequences. True to his word, Remington unleashed every trick at his disposal. Within days, Eloise found herself bombarded by threats, some delivered face-to-face by surly men on horseback, others scrawled on notes left at her gate. She was accused of trespassing on wealthy land, of horse theft, of interfering in private business affairs. Though none of these claims held real weight, she felt the constant pressure grinding at her resolve. She lost track of how many times she was told, "Give up the horse and we'll leave you alone." Neighbors began to grow uneasy. Some advised Eloise to relent, especially older folks who recalled the times when Remington had orchestrated land grabs or forced people out of their homes if they challenged him. But Eloise refused. She couldn't sleep much. Nights were spent in the stable, whispering words of comfort to Meteor, checking his bandages, and hoping her supplies would hold out. The horse was recovering more each day, though she feared what would happen if Remington succeeded in seizing him again. At length, certain that solitary resistance was futile, she sought help from the same neighbors who had shown initial sympathy. Word spread that Eloise was standing up to the mighty Remington Vance. Some admired her bravery, others feared backlash. Still, a few courageous souls rallied around her. They helped erect a sturdier fence around the ranch, donated hay and medical supplies, and stood guard in shifts, prepared to sound an alarm if Remington or his men returned in the dead of night. Meteor, unaware of the storm raging beyond the stable walls, continued his slow climb back to health. Eloise's tender care allowed him to put weight on his injured leg again, though he still limped. One cool evening, as she rubbed salve into his leg, Eloise said softly, "You're doing great, boy. Keep fighting." Meteor's big dark eyes seemed to reflect not only gratitude, but an uncanny understanding. She believed wholeheartedly that this animal was both a mirror of her own stubborn will and a symbol of a greater struggle, compassion versus callousness. Meanwhile, Remington escalated his efforts. He filed paperwork claiming Eloise had illegally obtained his property. The local authorities, however, were reluctant to side with him outright. His name carried weight, but so did the mounting public sentiment that he had tossed out a living being like disposable trash. Public whispers swelled into a quiet uproar. Farmers asked, "What if he tries to claim my animals too?" Others recalled times Remington had used intimidation to expand his estate. The tide of opinions slowly turned against him, or at least cast doubt on his methods. Perhaps, they reasoned, some lines shouldn't be crossed, even by a man with deep pockets. In the thick of it, Eloise's resolve never wavered. Though fear was an uninvited companion at every turn, she had friends, neighbors, and most importantly, Meteor. The horse's presence reminded her that if she were to yield, she would negate the second chance she'd given him, and the second chance she'd given herself, proving she could stand up to someone as formidable as Remington Vance. Tensions flared again when Remington showed up at the crack of dawn with a small legion of hired men. They arrived on horseback and in vehicles, encircling Eloise's property like a blockade. Startled from her early morning chores, Eloise rushed outside to find these men forming a wall near the gates, while Remington sauntered forward with calculated confidence. Over the past weeks, rumor of their standoff had spread far beyond the town. Some journalists had even begun sniffing around, sensing a scandal involving a high society millionaire and an underdog rancher. A hush fell over the ranch as the confrontation unfolded. Eloise, flanked by her neighbors, gazed unflinchingly at Remington. For all his outward composure, she noticed a flicker of frustration in his steel-gray eyes. "Are you ready to surrender, Miss Caldwell?" he asked. His voice carried across the crowd. "I have men here who are prepared to escort Meteor to my estate. There's no need for more trouble." Eloise's throat felt dry, but she found her voice. "Meteor doesn't belong in a place where he's only useful if he can race. You can't bully me into handing him over." A ripple of murmurs swept through bystanders. A few reporters, camera phones in hand, captured every exchange. Eloise recognized some faces, folk from neighboring counties who had heard about the millionaire's intimidation tactics. Their presence was a double-edged sword. On one hand, their coverage might pressure Remington to be less brazen. On the other, it could incite him to crush her swiftly and reassert his dominance. Remington's lips curled. "You don't understand how the world works. Money and power shape everything. What can you do against me? You own a rundown ranch. How will you feed that horse? Pay for his care?" Eloise inhaled, ignoring the flutter of anxiety in her chest. "I'll manage. I'd rather struggle with dignity than thrive under your rule." A sudden hush descended. Even Remington's men seemed taken aback by her audacity. While her words hung in the air, a figure separated from the crowd, an older woman in practical jeans and sturdy boots. Her name was Darcy Wilder, a longtime horse breeder known for her unwavering honesty. Darcy approached Remington, looked him up and down, and said, "Mr. Vance, if you truly cared about the stallion, you wouldn't have left him stranded. That brand might prove your ownership, but your actions prove otherwise." A few heads nodded in agreement, and Remington's jaw twitched. Never before had so many people dared confront him openly. Roland stepped in at that point, trying to seize control of the situation. "Enough," he barked. "By the authority of the documents Mr. Vance filed, we have every right to reclaim that horse." With a nod, half a dozen men marched toward the stable, their footsteps pounding in unison. Eloise's heart hammered. She threw herself in front of the stable door, arms outstretched as if to shield Meteor with her own body. "You'll have to go through, Mom," she said, voice trembling yet resolute. The standstill reached a fever pitch. Several bystanders, roused by Eloise's courage, followed suit, positioning themselves beside her. For one electrifying moment, it seemed a physical confrontation was imminent, pitting the raw power of Remington's hired men against the determined defenders. Then, a distant wail of sirens broke the tension. Three police vehicles rumbled up the dirt road, red and blue lights flashing. Officers emerged, scanning the crowd. Their arrival had been summoned by concerned witnesses who feared violence might erupt. A tall officer, badge gleaming in the early sunlight, separated the two factions. "What's going on here?" he asked, voice authoritative, yet tempered by caution. Remington, quick to capitalize on the formalities, stepped forward. "Officer, thank goodness you're here. That woman is holding my horse against my will." He produced a sheaf of legal papers, brandishing them as irrefutable proof. Eloise, eyes narrowed, exclaimed, "That horse was abandoned. I've spent months rehabilitating him. These papers might say he's Remington's property, but does the law ignore animal cruelty?" She glanced at the crowd, her eyes pleading for support. The officer studied both sides. He called for calm, then requested statements from Eloise, Remington, and several witnesses. Phones were pulled out as people offered pictures and videos of Meteor's recovery, of how Eloise had bathed his wounds and fed him by hand when he was too weak to eat. One older neighbor recalled seeing a truck in the dead of night, a black stallion limping as it was unloaded near the woods, though he hadn't known who was behind it at the time. As the testimonies piled up, the officer's expression shifted from neutrality to concern. It was evident that the situation wasn't a simple case of stolen property. A veterinarian who had assisted Eloise on occasion provided a medical record stating that when he first saw Meteor, the horse displayed injuries consistent with being cast off. Even a local journalist weighed in, sharing photos of Meteor's dismal condition from a few weeks earlier. Remington's nostrils flared at each new piece of evidence. Still, he refused to relent. "This is absurd," he barked. "A horse is my asset. If I choose not to spend a fortune on a lame racer, that's my prerogative. But no law says I forfeited my ownership." The crowd muttered angrily, many appalled by the callous statement. Eloise felt both rage and heartbreak surge within her. Meteor was more than a piece of property. "If you truly believe that, then you'll never see him the way I do," she said, voice cracking. The officer, sensing the moral gravity of the dispute, took a moment to confer with colleagues. Legally, Remington had purchased and registered the horse. Eloise, however, had a compelling argument that Meteor had been effectively abandoned. Animal welfare statutes in the region prohibited dumping an injured creature to die. If proven, Remington's claim to Meteor might be in jeopardy, and he could even face consequences for neglect or cruelty. "Until we can fully investigate," the officer finally said, "nobody is taking this horse off this property without a court order." A collective sigh of relief rustled through Eloise's supporters. Infuriated, Remington tried to protest, but the officer held firm. "Settle this through proper channels, Mr. Vance. If you want to press charges, go ahead, but it'll be a judge who decides, not you." Lips pressed into a thin line, Remington whipped around, muttering a final threat before storming to his car. His entourage followed, though they eyed Eloise and the crowd with clear resentment. The police lingered, taking more statements, ensuring the tension wouldn't escalate once Remington departed. Though no definitive victory had been declared, Eloise felt a quiet triumph swell in her chest. Meteor was safe, for now. The sun was setting by the time Eloise finally had a moment alone with Meteor. The stable was quiet, save for the soft rustle of hay. Exhaustion weighed on her, both physically and emotionally. She reached out to stroke Meteor's mane, feeling the silky texture under her fingertips. "We want a small reprieve," she whispered. The horse shifted closer, almost nuzzling her hand. In that gesture, she felt a sense of gratitude that words couldn't capture. In the days that followed, the legal gears began to turn. Remington Vance initiated a lawsuit demanding the immediate return of what he labeled stolen livestock. Meanwhile, spurred on by local activists and Eloise's allies, an investigation into Remington's potential animal cruelty began. While the case inched forward, Meteor's story spread beyond local gossip. A well-known journalist in the state capitol wrote a heartfelt piece about the standoff, painting Eloise as the every woman standing against a titan of industry. Animal rights groups latched onto her cause, criticizing the notion of discarding injured horses like worthless commodities. All the attention made Remington fume. In press statements, he dismissed Eloise's claims as emotional fabrications. Yet the more he attacked her, the more sympathy she garnered. Donations trickled in from strangers who read about her plight. Some offered feed, others money to cover vet bills, and still others simply sent letters of support. So while Remington spent lavishly on top-tier legal counsel, Eloise found she wasn't alone. She relied on a small law office willing to represent her pro bono, citing the principle at stake. No animal deserves to be tossed away. Over time, Meteor grew strong enough to venture from the stable for short walks. Though he moved with a discernible limp, his spirit seemed rejuvenated. Sometimes he'd whinny at the sight of Biscuit chasing butterflies, as though amused by the dog's antics. Eloise cherished these glimpses of joy. They reminded her that every day, Meteor was healing, and so was she, finding a new sense of purpose in defending him. The ranch, once a lonely place, now bustled with visitors and volunteers. Some stayed overnight, helping patrol the perimeter in case Remington or his henchmen tried any underhanded moves. One crisp morning, Darcy Wilder, the experienced horse breeder, came to check on Meteor. After inspecting his leg and feeling the tendons, she gave Eloise a small smile. "He's mending better than I dared hope," Darcy said. "With continued therapy, he might never be a racehorse again, but he can still live comfortably for many years." Eloise exhaled with relief. "That's all I want, that he lives a peaceful life. Racing is the last thing on my mind." Darcy hesitated, then put a hand on Eloise's shoulder. "There's a hearing coming up soon. Be prepared, child. Remington's lawyers will throw everything at you. They'll question your finances, your suitability to own a high-value horse, your entire character." Eloise nodded, her determination unshaken. "Let them. If I fold now, what message does that send?" Together they watched as Meteor nipped playfully at a tuft of grass. In that moment, the intangible bond between them felt almost sacred. No matter what legal blow might come, Eloise vowed she would not abandon him. She remembered her grandfather's words, "You never abandon those who depend on you." That principle had never felt more relevant. At last, the court date arrived. A throng of onlookers gathered outside the modest courthouse in town. Some came out of curiosity, others to show moral support for Eloise. True to form, Remington Vance arrived in style, stepping from a luxury car, donned in a tailored suit, flanked by lawyers. Eloise felt a clench of anxiety when she saw his entourage, but steeled herself. She entered on foot, accompanied by her own counsel, an earnest attorney named Caleb Rhodes, who specialized in animal welfare cases. Inside, the judge wasted no time laying out the issues. Remington, as plaintiff, insisted Meteor was his rightful property, that Eloise had no claim, and that her refusal to return the horse equated to theft. He presented ownership papers, registration documents, and records of Meteor's racing history. Under normal circumstances, such evidence would be bulletproof. Yet, Eloise and Caleb had a counter-argument. Remington had willfully abandoned an injured horse, in direct violation of cruelty laws. They called upon witnesses, neighbors who testified to seeing mysterious men dumping a black horse in the night, along with the veterinarian who treated Meteor's infected leg. The veterinarian recounted the horse's near-emaciated state and injuries consistent with being left to fend for itself. Evidence also emerged of how Remington had pressured local officials to keep quiet, suggesting a deliberate cover-up. Even the brand on Meteor's shoulder took on a new meaning. Yes, it bore Remington's mark, but it also highlighted that he had a responsibility he neglected. Remington's legal team attempted to deflect blame, painting Eloise as a meddling do-gooder who had no right to meddle in private business. "She's just an attention seeker, living off the generosity of misguided sympathizers," one lawyer argued. Eloise stiffened at the accusation but stayed silent, letting her counsel handle the rebuttal. Caleb countered by pointing out the letters and donations from across the state, all championing Eloise's rescue efforts. "If caring for a suffering animal is seeking attention," he said pointedly, "then perhaps we need more of that kind of attention." For 2 days, testimonies were heard. Journalists wrote feverishly. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a calm but perceptive gaze, asked tough questions on both sides. On the second afternoon, she retired to her chambers. An air of suspense gripped the courtroom, intensifying with each passing minute. Eloise fiddled with a worn leather bracelet, imagining Meteor waiting back at the ranch, blissfully unaware of the swirling drama. When the judge reemerged, she delivered her decision with measured authority. Meteor would remain with Eloise. In the eyes of the court, Remington Vance had relinquished his legal claim by abandoning the stallion in a manner that violated cruelty laws. Though the official paperwork listed Remington as the purchaser, that claim was nullified by the act of willful neglect. Moreover, the judge scolded Remington for his behavior, implying that had he chosen to rehabilitate Meteor, the outcome could have been different. A mild financial penalty was also imposed for the unethical disposal of an injured animal, though it was a mere slap on the wrist compared to Remington's vast wealth. Eloise's heart soared. She sagged with relief, tears of gratitude pricking at her eyes. By her side, Caleb offered a congratulatory handshake. A smattering of applause rippled among the spectators. Remington's expression was thunderous, but for once he had nothing to say. The law, it seemed, had found a moral backbone. Under camera flashes and hushed excitement, Eloise walked out of the courthouse a victor, one who had refused to let might overshadow right. The courtroom victory sent waves through the community. Locals spoke in hushed awe about how a young woman of modest means had outmaneuvered Remington Vance. Journalists, enthralled by the story of one determined rancher facing off against a wealthy magnate, ran follow-up pieces and interviews. Some animal rights groups even hailed Eloise as a champion of neglected horses. As for Remington Vance, he retreated to his estate, his public image tarnished. While his fortune remained largely intact, whispers circulated among his elite peers. Sponsors withdrew from certain events he hosted, unwilling to be linked with a man who so brazenly valued profit over humane treatment. Over time, he shifted focus to other ventures, leaving horse racing altogether. He'd lost not just Meteor, but the unblemished reputation he once treasured. Meanwhile, Eloise resumed her quiet life, though quiet might no longer apply. Meteor's presence had altered her ranch profoundly. Donations continued, enabling her to install better fencing, repair outbuildings, and improve overall conditions for her animals. She even began taking in other neglected creatures. With Darcy Wilder's guidance, the ranch evolved into a small sanctuary. People from miles around brought stray dogs, injured goats, or abandoned horses, certain they would find compassion under Eloise's care. Through it all, Meteor thrived. He'd never regained the speed or stamina that once made him a champion, but his regal bearing turned heads, and his gentle nature made him a favorite among visitors. Children who ventured to the ranch would stroke his muzzle, wide-eyed, as Eloise recounted how he'd survived abandonment and fought his way back to health. In their eyes, Meteor was a living testament to the power of mercy and perseverance. One warm afternoon, Eloise was grooming Meteor when Darcy approached with a teasing grin. "Someone wants to race him for fun?" Eloise asked, glancing at Darcy. The older woman laughed. "No, but there's a local riding group that organizes peace rides. Slow, scenic treks for horses who've retired or are recovering. I thought maybe Meteor could join. It'd be great physical therapy, and it shows the world he's still got a role." Eloise's eyes lit up. "He'd love that, and so would I." And so Meteor's next chapter began. He trotted gently along winding trails, sometimes carrying Eloise, sometimes a trusted volunteer. He caught the attention of families who had heard his story, and more hearts were touched by his resilience. Over time, Eloise's ranch became known as Caldwell's Haven, with Meteor as its centerpiece. People joked that the once high-speed racing stallion had transformed into an equine ambassador of second chances. Still, life was not without challenges. Some of the animals required expensive medical treatments, and Eloise occasionally felt overwhelmed by her swelling responsibilities. Yet she refused to let adversity overshadow the core mission that had taken root, giving injured or abandoned creatures the environment and respect they deserved. Each morning, as she walked through the stables, she'd pause at Meteor's stall, feeling a surge of thankfulness. She had risked everything to protect him, and in saving Meteor, she had discovered her own calling. Years slipped by. Remington Vance's downfall had become part of local lore, an oft-repeated tale in which power and wealth couldn't prevail over stubborn compassion. Meanwhile, Caldwell's Haven gained prominence. What began as a place for a single abandoned stallion transformed into a sanctuary for abused animals of all types. Horses with broken bones, dogs rescued from harsh conditions, even a few orphaned lambs. The ranch grew physically with new barns and fenced pastures funded by kind-hearted donors. Volunteers from distant towns arrived, all inspired by Eloise's story of defiance and empathy. Meteor aged gracefully. His once jet-black coat became flecked with gray, but his eyes still glimmered with the same quiet determination that first caught Eloise's heart. She made sure he never lacked attention. Daily brushes, healthy food, gentle exercise. Occasionally, she'd catch him gazing at the horizon, ears perked, as if recalling the days he'd galloped at breakneck speed under roaring crowds. Yet if he missed the glory, he never showed it. Instead, he seemed content in his new life, greeting other rescued animals with soft nickers. One brisk autumn day, Eloise strolled the perimeter of the ranch. Crisp leaves crunched underfoot, and the air carried a promise of winter. She spotted a group of kids from the local school, wide-eyed as they listened to Darcy regale them with Meteor's heroic tale, how he'd once been left for dead but found salvation through love. The sight warmed Eloise's soul. Because of Meteor, countless children learned a vital lesson, that every creature, no matter how broken, deserves a second chance. As she continued her walk, she passed the donkey Luna, still faithfully hauling supplies. Biscuit, the ever-loyal dog, now peppered with gray around the muzzle, and a cluster of new arrivals, a pair of frightened ponies and a limping mule recovering from harsh conditions at a distant farm. This ragtag menagerie symbolized the triumph of empathy over neglect. It was proof, if ever she needed reminding, that compassion could flourish in even the hardest soil. Eloise paused at the old fence line where she once stood in Meteor's defense, confronting Remington's men. The memory still stirred her pulse, reminding her how fear had nearly paralyzed her, but determination had pushed her forward. A lot had changed since that day. She had grown more confident, guided by the knowledge that doing the right thing might be terrifying, but it was infinitely better than living with regret. She caught sight of Darcy waving at her from near the main barn. The older woman approached carrying papers. "Remember that riding group we teamed with a while back?" Darcy asked. "They're hosting a big fundraiser. They'd like Caldwell's Haven to be the beneficiary. Thought we could set up an open house, let folks meet the animals, especially Meteor." Eloise grinned. "That sounds perfect." Later that evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Eloise finished feeding the animals, saving Meteor for last. Standing in his stall, she stroked his neck, feeling the softness of his coat. Meteor breathed out contentedly, leaning into her touch. She recalled the earliest days when he could barely stand, how she fed him scraps of bread and cradled his swollen leg in her palms. Now he was a pillar of strength and gentleness. "You've given me so much, boy," she whispered, her voice hushed by the soothing hush of the barn. "I saved your life, but you saved mine too." Months later, the fundraiser Darcy had mentioned took place on a bright spring afternoon. Banners fluttered in the breeze, colorful stalls displayed handcrafted souvenirs, and children giggled as they fed treats to the friendlier animals. The highlight of the event was a gentle parade where visitors could walk beside the sanctuary's horses, observing them in all their dignified splendor. True to form, Meteor led the parade, stepping carefully but proudly. Eloise walked alongside him, her hand lightly resting on his halter. Cameras clicked from every angle, capturing the image of a horse once abandoned, now cherished by all. People chatted excitedly about his story, how a lonely ranch girl had stood up to an affluent tycoon and emerged victorious. A handful of well-dressed guests from the city even approached Eloise to express their admiration, offering continued financial support to Caldwell's Haven. At the end of the day, the event raised enough money to fund the sanctuary's operational costs for months. It was a monumental success, a celebration of hope, resilience, and the unstoppable force of kindness. In the reflective calm that followed, Eloise wandered into the stable where the volunteers were tidying up. Meteor dozed in his stall, ears twitching at stray noises. She leaned on the door, soaking in the contentment that filled her. "We did it," she murmured, recalling how uncertain everything once seemed. She thought of Remington's wrath, the legal battles, and the nights when she feared someone might sneak in to snatch Meteor away. Yet here he was, safe, beloved, and thriving. Darcy appeared at her side, resting an elbow on the stall's wooden ledge. Not bad for a so-called meddling do-gooder, eh? She teased, referencing Remington's lawyer's accusations. Eloise laughed, a sound tinged with both relief and quiet pride. Guess not. Sometimes the best things in life come from doing the right thing, no matter how uphill it seems. Darcy nodded, her own gaze fond, as she watched Meteor shift in the straw. Outside, a final group of visitors slowly made their way home, the sky tinged with pink and orange. The ranch had never seemed more alive. In truth, the entire area buzzed with renewed vigor these days. Farmers who once endured intimidation had found a voice, forming cooperatives to stand against exploitation. Caldwell's Haven had sparked a subtle but potent shift in local attitudes, a reminder that empathy isn't weakness, but a form of strength. Standing there, Eloise recognized how deeply connected she was to every soul on the ranch. The donkey Luna, who had carried water that fateful day, the dog Biscuit, who once barked at Meteor's arrival, and Meteor himself, the reason she discovered just how unyielding her spirit could be. If any doubt lingered about her life's purpose, it dissolved in that moment. She was exactly where she needed to be, carrying out a mission that echoed her grandfather's teachings. She pressed a gentle kiss to Meteor's muzzle, and he blew soft air back at her. As the sun dipped behind the hills, she took it as a silent promise that their shared journey would continue, guided by kindness and fueled by unbreakable resolve. With time rolling on, Meteor became something of a legend in the district, a symbol of perseverance, empathy, and the triumph of moral conviction over brute force. Local schools invited Eloise to speak about animal welfare. Animal rights organizations named Caldwell's Haven a model sanctuary, praising Eloise's meticulous, heartfelt approach. Volunteers remained steady, forging friendships within the sanctuary's daily rhythms. A few had backgrounds in veterinary medicine, offering advanced care. Some were simply animal lovers wanting to make a difference. No one had heard from Remington Vance in years, though his name still drifted through conversations about men who hoarded wealth and power without moral restraint. He receded into luxury, rumored to be dabbling in foreign real estate and exotic car collections, anything but horses. Some found it ironic that the man who once built his fame on champion racehorses could no longer face that world. Karma, people joked, had galloped straight into his life. Eloise rarely gave him much thought. She stayed focused on her small kingdom of misfit creatures and the supportive community that had blossomed around them. Indeed, the once isolated ranch now hosted workshops about responsible pet ownership and sustainable farming. Children's laughter echoed between the barns as they learned to ride gentle ponies or fed treat pellets to grateful goats. Meteor, by far the star attraction, basked in a level of affection unimaginable back when he was just a name in Remington Vance's racing lineup. Yet, for Eloise, the greatest victories were the quiet, everyday moments, the wagging of a once-abused dog's tail, the healthy whinny of a rescued horse finally free of pain, and the beaming grin on a child's face upon learning to handle animals kindly. Those instances were the real reason she persisted. Money had its uses, but it could never buy that sense of belonging, that soul-deep bond she felt with each creature. At dusk, as the sky softened to purples and deep blues, Eloise would do her final rounds, double-checking stable doors, ensuring each animal was fed and secure. Meteor, on cue, would poke his head out, expecting a good-night pat. His muzzle on her hand reminded her of the first day she discovered him, weak, trembling, but full of an untold inner strength. The path from that moment to now was shaped by unwavering resolve, community support, and a spirit that refused to let cruelty have the last word. When she finally turned in each night, Eloise closed her eyes with a peaceful heart. She had proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that wealth and power were no match for determined kindness. And in doing so, she'd not only saved Meteor, she'd transformed the entire culture of her ranch, her town, and even remote corners of her county. One horse had lit a fire in her that spread like a beacon, illuminating what humanity could be at its best. At the end of this incredible journey, we see how kindness, solidarity, and unwavering courage come together in a triumph of the human spirit. A once-forgotten horse finally finds a place to belong, and a determined young woman proves that empathy can outshine even the most intimidating displays of power. From the tense standoff to the moment the community unites, this story reminds us all that no act of compassion is ever wasted. It sparks hope that, in a world where might and money often prevail, there's still room for heartfelt connections and meaningful change. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Did this story resonate with you? Comment below and let's discuss how we can continue championing respect and kindness for every living being. Thank you for tuning in, and remember to subscribe for more uplifting stories that celebrate the enduring power of goodness.